If you place a human being in a violent ocean storm, their mind achieves a terrifying clarity. The threat of death strips away every minor anxiety, every daily distraction, and every illusion of control. In that moment of crisis, false beliefs and worldly attachments dissolve. Classical texts describe this as the moment the soul is reduced to its barest essence. There is no reliance on wealth or status. Every soul on that ship calls out to a higher power, completely aware of its own fragility and absolute dependence. But watch what happens the moment that same vessel hits the sand. Once safety is assured, the sense of dependence vanishes. The intense clarity from the storm evaporates, and the mind immediately returns to its old habits of ingratitude and self-reliance. We forget we were ever helpless. This predictable pivot from desperate clarity to total amnesia is the core obstacle to spiritual stability. The problem is not surviving the storm. The problem is how quickly the mind erases the lessons of the storm once the water comes. This tendency to forget is entirely natural. Classical scholars like al-Ghazali viewed this amnesia not as a malicious moral failure, but as a built-in human condition. We are constitutionally wired to adapt to safety and take our survival for granted. We can see exactly why this happens in this chart, which plots two distinct psychological responses over time. The sharp upward spike represents awe, the feeling of absolute smallness in the face of vast danger. The second, descending curve represents gratitude. A crisis forces the brain into a state of awe because the scale of the threat demands total attention. But once the crisis passes and a benefit becomes routine, gratitude quickly drops to zero. Safety simply becomes the new baseline, and the mind tunes it out. Because our biology actively overwrites gratitude with routine, good intentions are not enough to keep us awake. We have to actively build psychological structures designed to bypass our own neural wiring. The metaphysical texts of the classical world recognized a specific threat that targets this biological blind spot. They describe the adversary, Iblis, or the ego, as a force that makes destructive paths look fair and reasonable, exploiting our natural tendency to let our guard down in times of peace. But these texts also outline a clear limit to this threat. There is a state of being called the mukhlasin, the sincere ones. These are individuals who have purified their intentions so completely that external seduction has zero authority over their decisions. The mystic Rumi observed that temptation fails against these individuals because they have already surrendered the very things the ego uses as bait. You cannot bribe a person with the illusion of self-sufficiency or status if they have already organized their entire life around serving a higher power. Modern neuroscience maps out a remarkably similar mechanism when it comes to human decision-making and how we resist distraction. This model illustrates the prefrontal cortex, the center for planning and value. When engaged in a single goal, the brain suppresses distraction. By unifying intention, it creates a physical barrier. Competing desires fail to register. They dissolve on impact. By aligning the prefrontal cortex with a single value, spiritual sincerity builds a literal barrier against the distractions that lead to regret. This isn't just a philosophical choice. It is a way to reorganize your brain to defend your own highest intentions. To achieve that unified state, you have to clear out the mental noise competing for your attention. The first and most counterintuitive tool required for this is radical forgiveness. Holding a grudge keeps the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, locked in hypervigilance, constantly burning energy. Forgiving disengages this response, shifting the brain into a parasympathetic healing state. This transition clears mental space, moving the nervous system from defense to receptivity. Classical teachers understood this biological release perfectly. They advised believers to forgive those who wronged them and let God handle the judgment. The goal was to keep the believer's own heart empty and clean enough to actually receive divine grace. Once the heart is cleared of resentment, the second tool secures the structure. That tool is the night vigil, acting as a form of psychological stress inoculation. Neuroscience shows that during the night, when external stimuli are low, the brain's default mode network becomes highly active in self-reflection and meaning-making. This quiet environment allows you to strengthen the neural pathways of remembrance before you are tested by the chaos of the day. The ones who remain steady when the storm finally hits are simply relying on the architecture they quietly built during the calm. Ultimately, running away from the storm is an exhausting way to live. The most resilient path requires shifting your motivation away from the fear of consequence and toward an understanding of human dignity. The scholar Ibn Arabi pointed to the concept of hal, the profound realization that you are in a constant state of being carried. Even when your feet are planted on solid ground, you are being sustained, provided for, and held by a power much larger than yourself. Behavioral research shows a distinct difference in how we maintain habits. Choices driven by the fear of punishment usually collapse once the threat disappears. But choices driven by a desire to honor your own identity, to live up to a standard of dignity, create sustainable, long-term change. If you genuinely believed you were already completely provided for, that your existence was deeply honored and sustained at every moment, how would you move through the world differently tomorrow morning? You don't have to wait for the next storm to figure that out. Pick one night this week. Sit in absolute quiet for just a few minutes. Let the noise fade, and remember that you are being carried. Let the stillness of the night teach you what the noise of the day keeps hidden.